Right, I'll kick off facilities. Well, the chief, I don't know if she's going to stay there or she's going to come up, but basically we lumped a lot of this stuff together because I know the council has heard a lot about the different facilities. We've talked a lot about Station 3. We've talked a lot about the Eco-Industrial Park. But the city has buildings, obviously, all over the community that have different purposes associated with them. One of the first projects that we worked on after I arrived was to go through and do a ranking of what we knew the facility needs were at the time. And the top, that would have been in 2007, the top priority was the police station. Obviously, we've built the police station since then, but then Fire Station 3, the library were identified on that list, as well as a new headquarters for the Parks building. We've addressed 2 of those 4. We've got 2 from that original list that remain to be done. During that period of time, we've also kind of aged out of the public services facility. When the second section of the building, what people affectionately call the tent, was put on that facility, I think that was 2003 or 2004, and it was meant to be about a 10-year improvement. Lasted until about 2014, and so here we are at 2018, and Ryan's been working on facilities plans now for several years to do a replacement on that one. City Hall was one that I wanted to just bring up because I think the council has been seeing what we've been doing with the reorientation in this building. City Hall was built to go 3 stories. It's built to add an extra floor, but I think people just thought that it was ultimately, because we could add a 3rd floor, we were never going to get cramped for space. Didn't really think about what it's going to happen to the building in the meantime until we get to the point where we can put a 3rd floor on. And then I'll let everybody else go first, and then I'll finish up with airport layout plan. So, Deb?
I was told you were going to cover it, so.
I certainly can.
Well, everyone knows we need a Station 4 and Station 3, I guess. We had the deployment study done in 2015. As you remember, I did a presentation before in 2007. Chief Jackson at that time brought to the council that a need for Station 3 was impending. We had not built a station since 1991, and at that time, I don't know what happened, but the council somehow didn't go after the land, or I don't know. Yeah. But 2007 was quite a long time ago. When Station 2 was built, the population was 18,000 people about. Now we're at over 40,000, and we still only have 2 stations. Therefore, the Station 3 became important. We were going for accreditation in 2014, and through the accreditation process, we were able to get a deployment study that was done by the National Safety Council, and they found that we need a 3 and 4 by 2020, I do believe. So we're a little behind, as you all know. So we've been working hard trying to find land in the areas that the deployment study showed that with the growth of the city would be the best spots to put those stations. You've all seen the deployment study, I think. You all have a copy. If you look at the executive section of that, the summary section, it does show where 3 and 4 would be best put. In doing that, though, the city actually grew in a different direction than when that deployment study was first done in 2015. We've grown more to the northwest. So Station 3 could actually be moved over more westerly. Amal has been wonderful to us. She's done some great GIS mapping for us to show different places that we put the stations. If we put 4 here, if we put 3 here, if we put, and how Stations 1 and 2 districts, how they overlap. So with her maps, we were able to see what areas of the city are we not covering by putting Station 3 here or putting Station 4 here. So with her maps, it's actually showed that we do need to move Station 3 slightly over to the west from where it was first proposed. Actually, it's still within where the deployment study showed, which is a half mile from the intersection of 10th Street and Tower Terrace Road. So as you know, the property that we're looking at does fall in that area, but it does show by moving it just a half mile more that way, we're actually covering more of the northwest where the city's grown more than what we anticipated. Due to the cost of land, since we're now since we should have looked in 2007 when we could pay for it by the acre rather than the square foot, I am actively looking for Station 4 land so that we don't have to pay by the square foot. So those are the things that I think the city really needs to look at in planning for our capital improvement projects. Those are two areas that we really need. As I said before, we've had 2 stations since 1991. It's been 27 years. The city's over double the size. So we are not reaching the citizens to the north in the timely manner that we should be. So kind of with the national standards is 4 minutes. We're way outside those parameters for the north part.
And to give the council some context on kind of where things started in 2007, if we had moved forward with what we thought the needs were at the time, we would have bought land on Elko Hill Road for Station 3. We had not done a formal deployment study. We didn't know exactly where the best placement of it would have been, but that was the corridor that we were looking at. So we did deliberately slow it down a little bit at that point because we hadn't had a deployment study done to figure out exactly where it needed to go. I think Tower Terrace Road was put in 2010 to create that connection in between 10th and Alburnett. At the same time, we were focusing on other projects to help increase the connectivity throughout the city and help reduce those response times. 35th Street North, for example, was put in, which dramatically reduced response times out to Hunter's Ridge. And we wanted to have some opportunity to really look at what were the impacts of making these transportation improvements going to be on our overall service levels. I didn't want to move forward with buying land until we knew for sure where the recommendations were, where the land was going to be. And I say, again, if we had, we would have bought land in the wrong location. Now, maybe it would have been in good location for Station 5 in 2029, but until we know for sure. The other thing that happened is 2008 hit. The recession hit, and we saw a pretty good slowdown in our rate of development. We never bottomed out like a lot of communities did, but we did see a reduction in the number of building permits that were happening in any given year. So our demand, especially our growth to the north, didn't really kick up again until about 2012, 2013. Now, in fairness, I would say right now we definitely are at what I'd call critical stage that we have to get things moving on Station 3 and get that one moving along. We also have a lot more information for knowing where we're going to need Station 4, and we have better internal capabilities to assess where we should place Station 4. So I think when I compare the positioning of a decade ago to where we are now, to be able to equip the council to make those decisions and make them rationally and in the best long-term interest of the community, we're in a totally different spot than we were back then.
And I would like to add, too, that the comprehensive plan that Tom was talking about actually can play a big role in this. He's already talked to me about the Indian Creek subdivision area, the Indian Creek plan, of possibly being a place where we could have a community fire station. So even Station 4 could be implemented into that plan. So actually by waiting a little bit, that helped with the comprehensive plan also. So we're looking at all of that. Also with his biophilic design, I would like to see Station 3 and 4 incorporate that. I think that'd be a good start. I think it would be a good example for the city to set for future developers to show how it works, and I think it'd be a good thing.
In the reverse referendum that we're going to go for Fire Station 3, are we including the land for 4 in that?
We could. There's actually some questions, and I know there's a whole rack of things related to the other fire stations too that we're going to be bringing to the council on just exactly how far do you want us to go with this bond, because we know that Station 1, for example, needs to be upgraded to meet current codes. Station 2 needs a facelift, and it needs some long-term maintenance done because it's going to be 30 years old before too much longer. So it really depends for what you have for an appetite as a council for how far you want us to go as part of this bond issue. All of those stations are currently in urban renewal areas, albeit different urban renewal areas, but they are all, because of that, all subject to reverse referendum language. So we have some options related to that.
And I'm assuming we'll get packages, if you will, like cream of the crop if we do everything we need, bare bones, and then a couple in between maybe?
Yep.
Yes.
Well, I recall the last discussion we had about that was we, as a group, were interested in looking at acquiring the land for number 4 so that we were not being short-sighted, and so they were buying it by the acre instead of by the foot.
Yep,
And
that's
also
correct. We
understanding
did.
station number 1 is not even up to code by our own code, so that certainly seemed to be a necessity as well. But
Yes, we did that during budget discussions.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
I agree with you with incorporating biophilic design. I think
Yes.
if we're going to be encouraging private developers to use these plans, we should be setting the example by at least
Yes.
incorporating them into our own construction.
Then the next one on the list is the library. I mean, this is probably the most publicized of our building projects, given by virtue of the fact that it's being contemplated as part of the Marion Mixed Use Project. But it does reach back to the ImagiNEXT initiatives. Expansion of the library was identified as one of the ImagiNEXT projects that we needed to pursue. And so with that, we started launching into what do we need to do? How much space do we need? How large should the library be? Where should it go? And had a couple of different studies done that play into that. One was a space needs assessment, which looked not only at Marion's needs, but also at the needs of our service area. Because our service area population, our library actually serves the equivalent of about 100,000 people. It's one of the most attractive ones in the metro area. I think we still flip back and forth with the main Cedar Rapids Metro Library branch as far as total amount of circulation that you have coming in and out of the building. We saw a bump in circulation after the flood. If memory serves me correctly, it was a little bit under 20%. So our usage curve was kind of going like this, and then we saw a bump, and our usage curve kept going like that. And then when the Cedar Rapids main library branch opened, ours dropped, but it didn't drop that 17%. Again, if memory serves me correctly, I think it was around 12 or 13%, but then our usage curve continued to go up. We do seem to hit a maximum just on what our facility can physically do and circulate based on the size of the facility at around 900,000 to 1 million items. So in any given year, that's enough to place us in the top 10 of public libraries in Iowa and the top 5 for our peer communities in Iowa. About the only things that outperform that would be like Des Moines, the main Cedar Rapids one. Maybe some of the academic libraries do a little bit better than that, but just to give you some context on how busy that facility actually is. And I know that we get maligned on this idea that somehow we're abandoning the new library, but it was built in '96, so it's already 20 years old, and it'll be close to 25 years old by the time that it's retired. If you look at Marion's history, we have been historically on a cycle where we do buildings about every 30 years. City Hall here was built in 2006. The prior one was done in 1977. The one over on 8th Avenue. And you can look back on the history of other facilities. The police station was about 30 years old. The public service facility is a little bit over 30 years old. So that's kind of tied in with our growth cycle. Unfortunately, the existing facility was built right at the beginning of where Marion began kind of their second growth boom. Like many suburban communities, we had one in the 1950s, and then growth kind of leveled out, was steady but slow through the 60s and the 1970s and the 1980s into the early 1990s. And then in the mid-1990s, like Ankeny and Clive and West Des Moines and a lot of communities, our growth just took off again. And we sailed past our 30-year population projections 12 years in to the new facility. So it's not that they made bad decisions. It's not that they did anything wrong. It's just that the conditions in the community changed around it. Now, if you look at the numbers, it would indicate that we actually need a library of 65 to 70,000 square feet. I don't know that that's feasible to do in the uptown. There's a significant feeling on the library board that the library has to maintain a presence in our uptown area. It's in the middle of what would be considered our most moderate income districts. There are a lot of people that walk to it that don't have other transportation options. There were questions about why don't you just go north and build an entire new facility and get what you need. Well, if we did that, we'd have to extend public transportation out there. There's an annual cost associated with that. What really cemented it for me, though, in looking at the costs of doing a standalone upgrade where it was all on its own, or doing an update to the one that we have and building a branch out to the north, was looking over the life cycle cost of the facility. And looking at the life cycle cost of doing the facility as part of the mixed-use project versus the other options, there's no contest. I mean, we will save millions of dollars over the anticipated life of the facility by being part of the mixed-use project. So not only do you take land that right now is non-taxable, and probably, I would say, one of, if not the most premier lot in the city of Marion, because it has a park view. You actually put the library into a place where we can take advantage of the 1,000 to 1,100 people a day that are coming in and out of it by having it in proximity to businesses, and you put tax base back on the rolls. The challenge that was really thrown in front of us was to try to meet the needs of the community for the library in the future, but let's not necessarily increase property taxes to do that. Because we did have the referendum that went out to increase the annual amount for property taxes. If you remember, we had 2 votes in 2013. Local option sales tax, single largest project proposed out of local option sales tax was $5 million to go to the library expansion. At the same time, we had one to go from 4 cents to 27 cents on the operating levy on the library. The local option sales tax passed, the other one didn't. It had majority support, but it didn't get to the 60% that it needed in order to be able to be put into place. So I took that message from the community as, yes, we're going to give you the money to build a new facility, but we don't want it to be more expensive to run. So how do you solve that? You actually put the library into a facility that produces property taxes to help make sure that you've got additional revenue being created at the time you do the library to offset the operating costs. So that's kind of where we sit. We know that the facility at 46,000 square feet isn't going to meet our needs, but when you started to dig into the library operations, at some point there's going to be a need for a north one, but that might be your 15,000 to 20,000 square foot branch. And frankly, up there, the metro area would probably be best served if it was a metro library, or it was a project between Hiawatha, Robbins, Cedar Rapids, and Marion, rather than each of us having a standalone facility up there.
Is that something we would, I guess that wouldn't be the CMPO because it's not, gotcha.
It would just be a 2880 agreement or something?
Yep. And in a lot of ways, the public doesn't really see it, but we function as part of a metro network effectively now. They're all using the same common software platform. If you check out a book, it's seamless, whether it comes from a Cedar Rapids library, a Hiawatha library, or a Marion library. So there's a relationship there between those groups already that can be built on.
We've already established the framework, and it would just be sharing a building, essentially.
Yep. Mm-hmm. The Eco-Industrial Park, as I touched on earlier, with the Eco-Industrial Park, we're much like other departments. Ryan's has been growing. Ryan's is sometimes a little bit easier because there's more of a direct relationship between things like miles of streets and how much you need for snowplows. That is driven by the level of service and the expectations of the community for how quickly you expect the streets to be cleared. But there's still, that is kind of a nibbling around the edge adjustment in my mind, because it might delay the need for one snowplow by a couple of years, but eventually you're going to get there anyway. The facility that they're in, the main facility, was built in 82, I think opened in 83, and then the addition was put on in 2003, 2004. Was intended to be a temporary fix. The wrinkle on this one is just looking at trying to be novel in how we approach it, to try to make sure that if we're going to do this and we're going to go down this path, can we do it by realizing enough operational savings to help to cover the cost of doing the facility, rather than just going out and building it and saying we're going to tack another 15% on top of the operating budgets of each one of these projects. So that's why it's taken a long time. We've looked at a lot of different methods to try to put this project together. The law changed, which put a significant crimp into being able to do the lease purchase project, and that's why we went to the construction manager method rather than construction manager at risk. So, up until, I'm going to say 3 or 4 months ago, there were probably still a lot, in my mind at least, there were still more ways that the project could not work than the project could actually work. But now I think we've got those figured out. We know what the legal environment is that we're going to be working in. It's just a matter of starting to put the financing mechanisms in place to do it. Much like we've done with other facilities, I think Marion has done a much better job of making sure that we're planning for the future with putting expansion room into our facilities. We kind of had a period of time there, most notably the last police station, that just wasn't built for the expansion that Marion has experienced. We've learned from that to try to make sure that we're not going to pigeonhole ourselves down and not have expansion options again in the future. You have anything you want to add on that one, Ryan? I know that one's probably more fresh just because that and the Fire Station 3 we've had the most discussions on recently.
Yeah, we did discuss phase one, which is the facility. Probably in the next work session, we're going to get into more of the details and mechanics. We'll have some decisions to make in terms of our renewable energy systems. We have to do that at least until our design's done. From that, we'll get into phase 2 and phase 3. We didn't get to touch on those at that work session that we had, and so that's going to involve the retail fueling station component as well as the material recovery facility. So those are still to come yet, but in terms of phase 1, the facility, we're in pretty good shape right now. So,
Lon, I have a question. If we were to have been engaged in that mixed management process and that law had changed on that, would we have been grandfathered in, or would we have been forced to take action to make an adjustment right away on that? Or
the law was written in a way that anybody who was actively in process with a project and had a contract in place could proceed. There was one exclusion that was written into the law for a community that conducted a special census in 2016 of under 20,000 population who wasn't quite into contract status but anticipated getting into that within the window of the signing of the legislation that had a little exception written in. But anything like Lynn County had a project that was already proceeding. The University of Iowa had several that were already under contract. So anybody that was to that stage was allowed to continue. But everything else now will be subject to public bidding in the future. The interesting one for me is the wrinkles that puts into what do we do with the library project, because as I think I've told the council, we will in all likelihood end up bidding the library portion of the mixed-use facility because of that change to the law. You can't use the lease purchase method that we had been contemplating on that. However, one of the stipulations will be that you have to have control of the property. So yes, it will be publicly bid, but there's only 2 entities that can show that they have a controlling interest in the property, and they probably are not going to be likely to bid against one another.
Dance around that.
I'll get on to City Hall then a little bit more here. With City Hall, I touched on this earlier. This building is built to go 3 floors. The mechanical systems are built to accommodate a 3rd floor. There's only one item that I try not to ever publicly criticize my predecessor. We've had a few differences of opinion, but there's one decision that was made that I told him I wouldn't have agreed with, and it regards the roof system on this building. Doesn't make it impossible to add the 3rd floor, just makes it a little bit more disruptive to do it. But the rest of it's there. The foundations are there. The mechanical systems are there. The electrical systems are there. It's a lot more expensive than it was when the building was built back in 2006. The reason I bring it up, though, is because we are also at the point where we're 10 years old. There are going to be some maintenance items that will need to be done to the building, some more significant improvements. If you walk around, you can tell that the paint and stuff is getting a little tired. There's chips and scratches that are going to need to be addressed. And we are really getting cramped for space. We have options to accommodate this phase of the reorganization, but I can't tell you that we're going to last another 6 or 7 years without needing to look at putting a 3rd floor on the building. So I think it's on our horizon. I would say it's probably within maybe just outside the 5-year portion of the CIP, but only just. So that'll be out there as well.
I mean, are there thoughts to relocate Medco and the chamber for the city to be able to use that space? I mean, I could see the multi-use facility when that gets going, that we can find a nice place to accommodate them and maybe extend the amount of time before that third floor is needed.
Yeah, Medco and the Chamber have indicated an interest for that. Both of them would like to be able to have a boardroom that can accommodate their boards.
Right.
Right now, both of their boards, the Chamber barely fits in here, and Medco's board is too large to hold their meetings here. So they have an interest in it. That will buy us some time. That would buy us several years, I think, before we would need to do something.
Okay.
Good question.
And finally, I wanted to talk about the airport layout plan. The airport layout plan is not really reflected in the CIP right now. When the CIP was being adopted, we've had some placeholders in there, but the airport layout plan, if you really dig into it, is the roadmap for the construction of the airport. It's kind of the mini comp plan or the equivalent of the neighborhood plan at Indian Creek for the airport, and it contemplates potentially some $20 million worth of improvements. And one of the tasks for the airport committee over the next year is going to be doing a deeper dive into that plan to say, okay, which one of these components really makes sense to do first? What's our sequencing going to be? The airport layout plan, I think, is good for getting your zoning and everything in place, making sure that you protect all of the territory that might ultimately be needed if you ever reach full build-out. But my feeling has been that it was written from an engineering standpoint and not necessarily a business operations standpoint. So it contemplates a lot of things that sequentially would need to occur, much like we've done with Alburnett Road, where, okay, you go out and you buy this piece of ground here for your east-west runway that you're going to put in 16 years from now. And that's fine. But with our airport and with the way that we're attempting to really kind of forge a new path by running this hybrid model, every step has to be justified by the business case for the airport. So we know we've got some basic maintenance and some basic work that needs to be done to maintain the infrastructure that we have. But our next stage would be to get the existing runway out to 4,000 linear feet. That's a magic number in the airport world. So once that runway reaches 4,000 feet, okay, did that increase our traffic 12%? You know, is there a business case then for going to the next stage, which is to get it to 4,200 linear feet? And after you get it to 4,200 linear feet, what does that do for your business? What does it drive to the airport and draw in? So that's the kind of thing that the airport committee will be doing a deeper dive into over this next year, is what's going to make logical sense, where are our stopping points going to be to go through and reevaluate and say, well, is this expansion really justified? At the same time, there are some known quantities. Things like a future fixed-base operator building we know is something that's going to be a need out there. You know, our private operator has constructed one right now, but they have a limited term on their lease, and even though we might have an interest in renewing that at some point, 10 years from now, if they decide, you know what, we're not making what we thought, we're not interested in doing this anymore, we don't have rights to that building. It's a publicly accessible building, and they've guaranteed that, but we would probably need to look at either buying it or leasing it from them or constructing our own. So those are the kind of things that we're just going to need to plan for in the future. The overall vision for the airport actually calls for the construction of an executive level FBO, which is something that's not available in our market. Concept behind that is to have something that's unique to Marion that would be a reason for people to stop here rather than to stop at other airports for fueling up. Fuel sales are one of the biggest sources of revenue for airports, and the more that you can drive people to stop here by giving them a first-class experience that you can't get somewhere else, something that would be unique, something that would be comfortable, the better off our facility is going to be. You do have those in some areas around the country. It's just not a concept that's really made its way to Iowa yet. And I would say that it would be a very difficult thing to do at a conventional airport because of the standards and the expectations that come with state and federal money associated with those.
For clarification, the FBO that was formally just tore down, we owned the FBO, correct?
That one we did, yeah.
Do we own the footprint that it sat on?
Yes, we do.
And do we then, we're not paying anything for the new location or the current FBO, is that?
Correct.
Okay, so it's just kind of an exchange at this particular point for that.
Yeah, an FBO is required, but the one that we had there, it would have been cost prohibitive to make the ADA upgrades and everything that were needed in order to really make it accessible. It just had a lot of issues, and this was more economical. Luxair wanted something that put a better face on the airport and was more reflective of more modern business operations, so they elected to just go ahead and build a new one.
Okay, perfect, thank you.
Can you speak to what, just at a high level, just tick off a few things that the airport would need to qualify for that executive level? What kind of amenities or services would need to be offered to set it apart?
Courtesy cars. So, for example, if someone wanted to come in and do a 2 or 3 hour layover because they needed service on a plane, or they wanted to refuel, or the pilot needed a chance to take a nap or something like that, you'd want to have vehicles available that they could use to travel into town so that they could get a bite to eat. You'd expect a level of fit and finish that you would not have in a typical airport. I mean, if you think about a regular commercial airport, they're nice but not too nice. They have an eye towards durability, but they sometimes tend to be a little bit austere. So, you'd have probably nicer finishes on counters, nicer finishes on floors, nicer furniture. But most of that is just creating that experience with the customer service that you would expect. One-on-one attention, just more about making sure that if they came to Marion, that you absolutely rolled out the first class welcome mat, so that if they've got a choice between stopping here in Monticello or Vinton or somewhere else, that the airport that they're going to remember is Marion's, and that's the one they're going to stop at. The whole idea is, we're talking about planes that can fill up in Chicago and make it all the way to Denver, that literally do treat Iowa like flyover country. Well, let's give them a reason to not treat it like flyover country, and rather than filling up in Chicago, fill up in Marion.
In some of the smaller airports, too, there would be like an observation deck or a flight deck, too, where, your pilots and captains would lay over, and there you could see, it's a high-level facility, so you could see out observation areas, and like you had mentioned, some of those recreational amenities that the pilots would need while they're waiting.
And they could play volleyball.
There you go.
Right? The Oasis.
To give you an example, one of the ideas that's been thrown around is we have Rockwell Collins right here. I mean, they've got a Gemini capsule stuck in a basement in one of their buildings somewhere. They've talked about having like an avionics museum attached to it, so that you have something there that could be kind of an attraction. Probably not something to the level of what you have with the Mississippi River Museum over in Dubuque, but certainly something that, again, you just don't see at your typical airport. And the nice thing about that is you start getting into things that are attractions for people outside of the airport community.
There's the Iowa 80 trucking stop. They have some kind of vintage car museum or something. I'm sure Paul would know.
A dentist, a beautician, hairstylist.
All right.
Massage therapist.
Okay. So if there's nothing else on that, we'll move on to compensation study. This is not something that we actually have a plan on yet, but it's something that's been touched on in a lot of discussions with the council. And I think, especially when we start talking about things like when we're having the discussions on pay for performance and where are we at in the market, what's the parity, are we really comparing apples to apples when it comes to positions in the community, this is something that would be critical for us to complete going forward. We have been working off of one that was actually done for the city of Johnston, but it's now a couple of years old. And as I look at Marion, the mayor makes the point many times about us being ahead of the curve. I think there's some opportunities for us to do that when it comes to positions. How are positions configured? What are the expectations for those positions? I think sometimes there's a tendency in communities to just look around and say, well, I need these functions. You've already got that job description, so I'm just going to go grab that without sitting back and saying, look, what do I need this person to actually do? What functions do we actually need to have completed? I have no issues with going out and creating something from whole cloth that no other community has if it fits the needs of Marion. We just didn't have to have some data to be able to fairly set compensation for that, or have a good understanding that if we're going to go out and recruit for somebody with that skill set, what is it going to take to land somebody with that skill set that you want to attract. I know we've had discussions before about the vertical wage scales within individual departments, but we do also have to be cognizant of the horizontal parity within the organization as well. We've made some corrections on it, but for example, if we're putting an assistant director on the books for public service and an assistant director for parks, for internal equity, they should be somewhere in the same range of compensation because they have very similar responsibilities. So those are the types of things that a compensation study will really allow us to address. At the same time, I think it'll give us a realistic expectation for what is that position actually worth out there in the market. One of the frustrations is that I've heard from repeated councils is really that the idea that wages just can't continue to escalate. You can't just add 2 to 3% every year because that's not the market for that position. There is a maximum out there for the value a position has in the economy, and the compensation study would allow us to figure out what that actually is.
Lon, could we go back to, I just got a real quick question, I apologize. I want to go back to the City Hall category here. What entities or what revenues do we collect in City Hall for rents, if you will? I know the Chamber, the Medco, Water Department? No, the Water Department does not pay rent because they made a capital contribution to the construction of the building that was basically the equivalent of what their rent would be. I can't remember what the percentage was, but they paid a percentage of the cost of the overall building up front. Okay. And do we collect any other revenues for rent? That's pretty much it, isn't it? Not in this building, no. I mean, we rent the old Digert Peck building down by Public Service. We rent the McGowan House, but not in City Hall. Gotcha. And how many employees do we have here in City Hall from the Water Department? From water, 5. And why, can you, just as an education to me, can you explain, as I look around the departments that are external from City Hall, why is Water Department, with the exception of the consumers pay their bills here, why does water reside here in City Hall? It was worked out when the original building, when this building was planned to be built, but they also, we contract with the Water Department to collect all of our bills and everything as well. So even though they are a separate division of the city, there's a pretty close relationship there. They do a lot of work with engineering, for example, when it comes to putting in water mains on street projects. So there's a lot of coordination that takes place, but it was also then the idea of one-stop shop, that where are people going to instinctively want to go to pay their bills, and the bulk of the water bill, if you look down at water is one component. We've got stormwater, urban forest, sanitary sewer, and garbage all listed on that same bill. So of the 5 employees that we have, how many technically sit at the counter out there? For water? Yeah. Water has 3 that are up at the front counter. 3 at the counter, okay. Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you.
That allows me to ask a question I don't have the answer to, and I've thought about it more than once. Is it normal for the Water Department to be a separate department in a city like this, and why is it separate? It varies a lot, actually, from city to city on how they do that. Even though they're a separate department, they are still a subset of the city of Marion. So they're on our state reports, everything like that. There was a vote that was held that actually empowered the Water Department, I think back in the 1950s, like 1952, to become an autonomous piece of the city of Marion. I'm sure there's some history with that. I don't know what it is, because they only...
He's gone.
Damn.
Yeah. They only carved off the...
Paul could have told us the vote.
Wikipedia walked away.
Yeah. Hey, maybe that'd be 2 weeks from now. He can
Wiki-Paul.
He can give us an update on the Water Department.
Wiki-Paul.
Wiki-Paul. Wiki-Paul. Hey, put a note over there. Wiki. I like that new nickname.
Yeah, I do too.
I will say that, Randy, or Steve, to your question, when that occurs, it is more common to see it be a combination. The community that I was in before I came here, for example, water and sewer were a separate entity, a wholly owned component unit of the city, but they were combined. If you look at places like Cedar Falls or Muscatine, they're a little more robust because they also have electric utilities. But like in those locations, you've got Cedar Falls Municipal Utilities, which is water, sewer, electric, and telecommunications.
Right.
Same thing with Muscatine. The unusual thing for Marion is to have it only be the water department, and I have no idea why sewer or some of the other ones were not included with that when it happened.
Yeah, the majority of the citizens don't know the difference.
Yeah.
Okay, right, thanks.
Are there communities that don't have a water department, where they
Oh, yeah.
hire that out?
Yeah, there are communities that just contract for that.
Yeah.
You know, they go with more of a minimal staffing contract management model. I will say those tend to be the ones that are smaller.
Yeah.
They'd be ones, well, for example, over in the area of the state where I grew up, you'll see communities that just franchise over to rural water systems and let the rural water systems run the utilities on their behalf. Or you get to Des Moines and you've got the Des Moines Water Works, which is a semi-autonomous combination of all of the water systems in the metro area communities that each entity has a board on, but runs as a joint agency.
Okay.
Okay. Well, we're close to being back on track, so I think if it's all right, I'll jump right into the YMCA.
Yeah. Keep going.
Okay. Mike touched on this earlier about our partnership with the YMCA for new facility, and I know this is going to be, again, more top of mind for the City Council because of the actions that have been happening with final site location and everything with that facility here in the last month and a half. But again, ImagiNEXT project, it was identified as one of our top priority needs to have a facility that better met the recreation needs of the community. Existing Y is more than 50 years old, built in 1963, about 35,000 square feet. The new one that's envisioned would be twice that, and more in keeping with the community's population, with the ability to expand and add another gym. If there's one area that I wish we had the budget to be able to do at this point, would be to add that fourth gym and just do it now, because much like City Hall, it's never cheaper to add it later with construction cost inflation and the disruption that you get from having to do the construction. But we do have some fiscal realities that we have to observe with that. With the YMCA, we're budgeted right now as a series of capital contributions that would be made to the Y. We've got it anticipated that about every 2 years we'd make a capital contribution to it, and then we have some local option sales tax that we've been accumulating that would go towards the facility as well. Mike and his staff have been working with the Y on doing some integration of our programming to make it more seamless to our residents as far as sign-ups, administration, so that you're offering community programs rather than necessarily city programs versus YMCA programs. As this comes forward, we will have some options for the council that you could choose to exercise that might make it easier or less expensive for the Y to be able to be constructed and to operate. So there are different models of it around the state for how it's done. Some of the more recent ones, for example, Indianola and Marshalltown, the city actually owns those facilities and then either has a lease back to the YMCA, like in the case of Indianola, or has an operations and maintenance agreement, like in the case of Marshalltown. As ours is envisioned, that's not the model we'd be doing right now. They would be looking at having it built and leased back by the development firm, and then the Y would own it at the end of the lease term with a couple of kind of off-ramps where they could elect to buy it ahead of time if it outperforms what they expect to see financially. Questions on it? Okay.
Mike, that was going to be one of the questions I was going to ask you earlier, and I refrained from asking it, but are we moving forward with those programs? I know you and I had conversations in the past about getting ahead of that so that when we do get to that point that we're more on board with that.
Yeah, actually, we have a working group of staff from Parks and Rec and staff from the Y that are meeting regularly to look at all the programming in both systems, how we incorporate those systems together. That's their first scheduled tasks. After we get through that part of the process, then we're going to start looking at, when all the programs are identified, then we'll go back, we'll start looking at what they might look like from a price point, what they might look like from a scheduling standpoint, where that would land, whether it be under somewhat of a Parks umbrella or Y umbrella. That's all background stuff. The front side of it, the citizen will not know. That's all background stuff that we're working on, but that's where the process is to date, working that part of the programming segment. And just to expand on that, it's all programming. We're including adult programming, youth programming, aquatics, everything. We're looking at every program that both entities offer and trying to incorporate what that looks like as combined programming.
Okay, good. That sounds like it's come a long ways then since we've spoke. So
It
thank you
has.
very much. I appreciate it.
Next one on there, we've got listed as community Wi-Fi. I know this is something that has probably not been on the radar screen of the entire council, but it was something that came out of the original ImagiNEXT initiative. We did have community Wi-Fi piloted in a couple of our parks initially. We ran into some problems with the way it was being used and abused, and ended up actually having to shut it down because of some of those concerns that we were running into. But we've recently been approached about the prospect of partnering up with Communications to do a successor program. They're building off of one that they've piloted down in the city of Iowa City to offer community Wi-Fi around certain targeted parks, certain public areas, so that people can come in and use the system. We've been evaluating the proposal and taking a look at it. We have some concerns about it because of some of the things that they're asking for and the value of what they're asking for versus the value of what we're ultimately getting, but that's simply negotiations in the contract. But what we didn't have a clear idea on is whether or not this was a priority of the council or not. If the council has no interest in it, then there's not much point in us continuing to engage in discussions or pursuing it with the company. There are some questions as far as, how could we do it? We'd have to lean a little bit on Iowa City for, how did you accomplish this, for example, without doing a bid? What they're offering is to be able to do community Wi-Fi in places like City Square Park, Lau Park. People would be able to log in for 2 hours a day and, excuse me, and be on the system at no charge. You would have to sign up. It would be through IMON's system and not the City of Marion, so things that we were having problems with before, like movies being illegally downloaded, we wouldn't have to deal with any of that because that always falls back to the provider. Before, when they were jumping on us or our system, we could have potentially been held liable for that, so that was too much of a risk for us to take. What they're asking for in exchange is some, and the chamber can do some of it, would be promotional consideration to be considered an in-kind sponsor for some of the community events and get some advertising. The kicker is what they're asking for from us is access to our fiber network. Marion has a city-owned fiber network that goes a lot of places throughout the community. We already have, though, parameters in place for leasing that out for private purposes. If an organization wants to come and say, can I lease a fiber run from here to here, we have a way that we handle that. They're asking for us to not charge for that, but they're also not giving us a ton of information about where do you want to go, how much capacity do you need. That would be kind of the next stage of discussions. That's where we get into the value of what we're being asked for to provide versus the value of what we're getting in return. So there are some benefits to it, significant benefits to it. For example, Marion Arts Festival, they would, on event days or things like that, they've said that they have no issues with lifting the 2-hour limit. Honestly, the reason for the 2-hour limit is because if you don't have it, what we experienced last time is that places that currently pay for internet, businesses, residents, start to use yours for free rather than paying for it. See, we were kind of unfairly competing with some of the pay providers out there. That's not the intent of the free Wi-Fi. It's intended to be an amenity, not a basic service. But they would lift it for things like the Arts Festival. And if you think about stuff like vendors using Cube or whatever they have for portable payment systems, there would be a lot of benefit to having the Wi-Fi available for those types of things. So there's community benefit for it, but without knowing that the council wanted us to continue to explore it, we've just been a little hesitant to really dive into it and get down to serious negotiations, because we didn't want to bring something back to you and then have the council say, well, why are you working on this? This wasn't in our CIP. What is it?
Lon, wasn't it an ImagiNEXT project? That was one of the things that came out of ImagiNEXT, so it's a community priority. I don't know, so.
Is the fiber network, is that an isolated just for city purposes, or is that something that's being utilized and has public access?
We have our own network that for the most part is discrete. We have some areas where we share ductwork, like with the school districts or the county, but it's almost exclusively entirely public entities. We do have a process there for private entities to do some leasing. For the first place that we did that was, for example, I think it was actually needed to get over to ESCO. They didn't have any assets in place, but we did, because we were getting over to Gill Park to serve the water department over there. So we put a cost per linear foot fee in place for them to be able to lease fiber from us to reach places like that.
So what is the CIP component to this? If we have the fiber network already in place, they want to access it, and they want to then roll it out to the community area, isn't IMON going to at least invest in some of that rollout, connectivity? They
would invest in the rollout and connectivity, but there are places where we don't have poles, we don't have electricity. Pick Lau Park, for example. They would want to go in, and they have the equipment to do a study of Lau Park to be able to come in and say, okay, we need to put 3 different repeaters in these locations. We need you to put a light pole or a pole in and get electricity over to that spot so that we can put it in. They don't really want to get into that. They'll provide the telecommunications equipment or the internet equipment, but the other piece of it would be something that they would want us to assume. Same thing with like electric bills, things like that. So there could potentially be a CIP component for those assets, but then an operating cost component for the ongoing utility side.
I'm sorry, go ahead. No, go ahead.
I know you and I had conversations a little bit before about this, that with the new library and the multi-use building, how we would provide that capability in the library, but not yet to everybody vertically. So part of it depends upon, all of the locations we would talk about extending this to. We're talking about the entire uptown area? Or
it would essentially be in the uptown footprint, no?
City Square Park and the Artway were the 2 areas that we had focused on.
Okay, so not the entire uptown, but more of a smaller
footprint.
Smaller footprint.
Yeah, and the newer equipment has more capability. It's more targeted. The older stuff was more broadcast a wide net. The new stuff is more directional.
I thought they had walked the footprint of the downtown, and that was kind of what it was going to be covered.
Yeah, they have some ideas, and they did do some preliminary study of City Square Park and the uptown area.
I would assume that IMON's interest in our fiber network would be for more of their marketing and direct marketing purposes. Am I off base on that? Obviously, you got individuals going in specific target areas. I would think that would be an incredible marketing feature for that. Obviously, using that service, and there's a huge benefit here. I'm just trying to find it.
They're also providing a service.
Yeah. And what they've said
but
is,
also with the exchange from the chambers in kind trade, though, as well. So, in my opinion, the scales are not tipped equally here. But anyway, please continue.
Well, and we have fiber into areas that go past neighborhoods that might not be on their build-out plans for a while. But if they could use our fiber to get to a neighborhood, they might be able to get in there 3 or 4 or 5 years ahead of when they can now. That's one of the things when I say we'd have to talk to Iowa City is, if we were going to contemplate that, how do we do that but make sure that we're not being unfair to the other providers in the area? You know, when we actually put the fiber network in, they were the only organization that was willing to do it. We actually partnered with them to put a lot of our duct work in because they were doing a major build through the community at the same time. So they have pretty good knowledge of what we have out there. We also then have to take a look, okay, you want to get out here, but what do you need for capacity? How much capacity do we have? Do you want to put your own fiber in our duct work? Can you do that? Or are you talking about using some of the fibers that we have reserved out there for our future use now?
Are those two different things? Whether or not they should provide free Wi-Fi in City Park, City Square, or whether or not they should use our fiber to provide service to neighborhoods. Are those intertwined, or are they two separate things?
It's what they proposed as part of the agreement to service with the community Wi-Fi as access to other pieces of the network.
Oh.
Now,
So
if they
that's the
could,
cost.
again, if they could define it and say, we want to get to this specific neighborhood or we want this run, I don't think, personally, I wouldn't have as many concerns or questions about it, but I can't sit here and tell the council, we're just going to give them carte blanche to use our entire network
I'm not sure that anybody
without
would want
defined
that.
parameters.
Yeah.
I mean, Imon's been running a lot of fiber, you know, in the last,
Well,
3 years.
If people are asking for them to have a bigger presence in Marion, and they're trying to get out here, but I'm not sure that that's our role to participate in that and to facilitate that when there's other providers too. But if there's a way to work out where they can provide the free Wi-Fi, which is a community priority that was identified in ImagiNEXT, you know, to certain public spaces, and we can work that out, that's a whole different issue than
Let me ask this,
having
though.
free access to the entire fiber system.
Let me ask this about free community Wi-Fi, though. That was 10 years ago.
Yeah.
Is it still a necessity?
I don't
Because
know.
everybody's got
Everybody's
this now.
got
And how many
hotspots.
people in here have unlimited data on their phone?
I will say that it was also indicated in the community branding plan as an additional recommendation.
Was it?
I'm not sure how high up it was on the ImagiNEXT listing this year, or if it probably appeared on there somewhere. I'm just not sure how
It was.
high that was.
It was?
It was, but not
Prominently.
wasn't a major thing.
But what Lon is saying, I mean, those questions and a lot of other ones have not really been contemplated yet because we don't have direction on whether or not to move forward. One of the hidden costs would definitely be staff time. This isn't something that was coming forward as a staff recommendation, and so it would take a significant amount of time from the IT staff side of things. And so if this is something that we are directed to move forward with, it could potentially slow down the implementation of the security camera system, just because that would be one person managing those two projects at the same time. So just wanted to make council aware of that as well.
I think from my perspective, and this is just mine, that I think it would warrant that conversation with Iowa City or whatever city you just mentioned, Lon, is to have that conversation to say, is there value? What's the cost? What's the trade-outs? I know we've been having some issues with public, with children hanging around uptown because they are using Wi-Fi's, and there's a whole plate of spaghetti that comes along with this. And I wouldn't want to spend a lot of time without at least having that conversation to say, what are the other communities doing? You know, you hate to put the parental controls on it, but is it something that shuts down at 10 o'clock at night and comes back up at 8 in the morning, or is it on only during events and off events? I mean, there's a lot of, I would think, like you said, it's a a la carte, so to speak. You can almost make it what you want, but obviously there's a lot of trade-offs to it. But that would be just my opinion about it. I know you may be looking for some direction on that, but
I just have a couple comments about that. I'm not sure. I know we've been talking a little bit about wireless creating an environment of youth coming together and things. I don't know that we have hard data around that yet, or if it's still sort of a speculation, because often they'll have a phone out and things like that. The other part is, I'll just remind folks that we started circulating Wi-Fi hotspots as a Metro Library Network last year, and that remains, I believe, the most in-demand item that any of the three of us circulate. And what I mean by that is the ratio of holds to items is the greatest. So while it seems like probably everybody in this room has very easy access to Wi-Fi, and our phones work as hotspots and all of that, we know that in our service area, that's not a true commonality.
We have to think about serving everyone,
Yeah,
But
as
it's
part
the
of this,
hotspot.
not just the people, yeah.
Well, I would like to
Fun.
make sure we're very clear on what a hotspot is, though, as well, too, because that, like you said, we're not here to replace the independent market's service that they are providing at a fee, but that's what the hotspot does. If I want to use a hotspot for 5 hours for a project, I'm coming to the library to get that, to use that service. It's a one and done. But these other deals, I don't think we're putting apples to apples on that particular deal on a hotspot.
yeah, we did have conversations early on in this, for example, with Marion Independent, because they have moved to a 1-to-1 ratio of students and devices. But they are sensitive to the fact that, right now, even though they have that, there are kids that will go to coffee shops or sit outside the library or come to the library because they do not have internet access at home. So they have the tool, but they don't have the mechanism to be able to address it. So as part of this project, we talked about, well, should we pilot it around a school building, or do you have a specific neighborhood or something like that we could focus on doing something like that in as well? They're willing to pilot that for probably 1 or 2 schools in each of the districts based on the demographics and the needs that they can identify. But that's kind of a second phase to it. My concern is just making sure that on the community side, that we are getting value for value. I don't have an issue with having something out there that has a contract with IMON that says you're going to provide this service in exchange for, like-kind use of X number of feet of fiber, but I don't want to give them access to the whole network, because we did establish that mechanism that if MediaCom or CenturyLink or somebody else came in and said, you know what, I'm going to be taking over, ESCO is going to contract with me now, we can't have something exclusive with IMON that only allows IMON to get to ESCO using our system. That's just kind of what we have to navigate.
Ellsworth, going back to that hotspot, what is the limitations on that when they are loaned out? Is there a download? What's the gigabyte and what's the time frame? Is that unlimited, or does that have a 2-hour maximum download?
Most of them circulate for 2 weeks. There are some that circulate for a little bit shorter. And we don't circulate them with less than a certain amount of data left on them, which equates to half of the data that comes for a month. But so if you checked one out and you used it 24 hours a day, you used up all the data, we would not circulate that again until it was refreshed, which is in a month. So everyone's guaranteed at least, I can't remember offhand what the gigabytes or whatever it is, but there's no stipulations like you can only use it X number of hours, etc. There's not a limit to how many devices you can hook up to it.
So it's an unlimited time and source until the contract is fulfilled for that 30-day cycle on that hotspot,
For that
on that
item.
hardware.
Yep. And it will throttle if
Right.
you use it all the way up. That hasn't happened more than a very few handful of times. And when it has, it's been people who take it on a road trip and are listening to like live feed audio the whole way.
Right. Okay, perfect. Thank you.
Ellsworth, that made me think, because it seemed like we have a lot of that going on, the checking out. Do you know how many people are repeat customers, so to speak? Like, are we cycling through the same people? Maybe there's like a startup kind of person, or et cetera, or is it really diverse and there's a waiting line and almost everybody's new each time?
I'd have to look. I think I could access that, and whether they're repeat users or not.
Mm-hmm.
We certainly have repeat users who come in and try to get what we call quick picks, which are the ones that you can't put on hold. And it's just sort of serendipitous if somebody returned one and you're the next person to ask. But I would say as far as who checks out the regular ones, it appears very diverse. But I'll ask to run some stats on it.
Okay. I know you wanted to get feedback. I'm not in favor of the Wi-Fi everywhere. I mean, maybe in Uptown, particularly associated with the plaza, et cetera, but when you mentioned Lau Park, I cringed, because to me, the whole point of most of the parks and the outdoor areas to escape this. And I can't imagine putting in equipment and then you start having people on the trails, and I mean, I don't know what they're doing. I think that there's a lot of access. I would want to do it in a very limited way, and I'm worried about picking winners in terms of, allowing IMON to have this exclusivity, and then the security concerns with having access to our infrastructure, our wired infrastructure. So too many big questions when I don't hear about it out in the community. It wasn't as highly identified on the recent community survey. It's something, and then Amanda mentioned the amount of staff time that would probably need to go into it. It's nothing I'm interested in personally right now.
Yeah, I'd certainly want to reassess the community need,
Yeah.
and see if it's truly there. I mean, a lot has changed in the last 10 years, so.
Yeah, when we looked at it and started trying to kind of brainstorm, okay, if we were going to do this, what locations would you be looking at? We did try to target it around ones where you held events. And in the case of Lao in particular, that might be one where it would only be during events. So you might have it during dueling pianos, you might have it during the barbecue rendezvous, or when things like, weddings or things like that are happening out there.
Why would you need it during those events? Like, what am I not seeing? That why would people, they go to the event to see the event, why do they need Wi-Fi?
Oh, people live stream. I mean, there's all sorts of stuff that people will do at those events.
Right, so then instead of seeing dueling pianos, then you see everybody doing this with their phone. And
you watch it through your screen instead of
yeah, exactly. That's my whole point.
Yes.
That's what I don't want to.
Well, and that's why I like that limited hours, because we don't want cars pulling into parks at 1 o'clock in the morning to get their feed on the internet, and obviously we just don't want that. But
It sounds like anything we do we're going to be talking about a number of restrictions and limitations, so.
Just to give you an idea, Renee, Darren Andreessen, one of my assistant engineers, a lot of times they have a younger one, and then they have two older ones. And the older ones are typically playing like a basketball, or, they're actually contributing to the sport event that's going on.
Mm-hmm.
And to keep the little one busy, it's on Wi-Fi watching something.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I don't want to support that. I'm sorry.
But that's just what a lot of people do.
Like parent or
that's the
give
new
them a book.
babysitter.
New babysitter.
Trying to get my
coloring book.
grandkids off of that.
And not to discount your view, but
Right, I get it, I'm one
we're supposed to
person.
do what is good for the community or what the community wants, not what we personally
I
think is
totally
good
get
for
it,
us.
and that's
So,
why it's
and I'm not
fallen.
discounting your view. I'm just saying that we should be thinking about what the community wants or what's good
Well,
for the
and
community.
I have to look back and see, but I think the last time we actually did a survey on it, something like 86% of the community did have access to internet. That's still 14%. And 14% of 40,000 people is a lot. So, I mean, yeah, we can talk a lot about the business benefits or everything like that, but there is still a significant chunk of our community that just flat out doesn't have access. And I think Ellsworth would be able to tell you that a lot of the folks that might come to the library to use it, they're looking for jobs. I mean, they're using it for productive purposes. It's not just for entertainment, but they either don't have it or can't afford it at home. We do need to be cognizant of that, and that's part of kind of leveling that playing field for accessibility.
There's students doing homework where homework, I see my kids, it's all online. So it is a necessity almost for people, and not everyone has access.
And our new library accounts for a bigger footprint dedicated to computers and internet access, et cetera.
Mm-hmm.
I'm guessing. Okay.
And I would also just remind folks that recreation is an important part of experience and where you live. So I think it gets really risky really fast to start to quantify what's a legitimate use. Why do I get to decide what you're going to use access for, especially when I own that privilege right now myself? So I think that's another piece to remember.
I would lean more towards looking into getting the Wi-Fi for a city than not. So
I think we can at least follow up with Iowa City and see, what their experience has been. They're about a year or a year and a half, maybe even ahead of us on this. So there should be some good feedback out there that we can find out. How's it been working? What have you seen? Where are you at in the process? Okay. So then we're getting down to the point where we're starting to talk about the 4 elephants in the room. Actually, I would consider them to be 3, because one of them is more, the one about the little things, staying in the know, that's more about communication initiatives and really a lot of policy initiatives that were lumped together about things people might like to see changed about the way the city or the community operates. But certainly the Plaza project, the pool, and the Indian Creek recreation activities all have the potential out there to be shall we say, expansively financed, especially with Indian Creek and the pool. You can probably literally spend as much as you want on either one of those two alternatives. We have some money in the CIP right now for going to the next stage with the aquatic study, which should help us to determine that. When Mike was talking about the master parks plan earlier, one of the things that I didn't know when we launched into that was I didn't really have a good sense for where do you reach the stage, how big does your community have to be before you start looking at a system of smaller pools rather than just one centralized pool. And so that gave us some guidance by saying that, Marion, for the foreseeable future anyway, is still going to be able to be served by one centralized larger facility. So, unlike Cedar Rapids that has Beaver and Knoll Ridge and Cherry and Ellis and all those, there's not a reason at this point for us to start looking for a distributed system of it. I will qualify that and say that, when it comes to aquatics, we can't forget that splash pads would be something that would fall under that umbrella as well. And, we've already started serving the community with those. We have 3, even though one of them is at the existing pool, but the park board has done a lot of work to try to start distributing those throughout the community. And I would hope that that would be something that, as we continue and look into the larger aquatics, that's hopefully something that we will be able to continue. And I'm going to talk about the pool before I talk about the Plaza project and Creekside Pride. With the pool, you've got the option there of being able to put that out in front of the voters. Pools are considered to be general corporate purpose. In virtually every case I've ever seen with a swimming pool, it's something that gets put out for the community to vote on. I think even when Cedar Rapids back in 2003, 2004 did theirs, it was like a 1-year or a 2-year local option sales tax, and they use the local option sales tax to completely update and do their pools. That's why they're all the same age. Depending on timing for how ours would come together, the 10-year for the pool expires, I think, 2024. So that could be something that would be looked at as the next phase of local option sales tax, or the council would have the option to be able to go out and just do a straight bond vote for installation of a new pool. Most of the time, if you've done your work ahead of time and you've worked with a consultant and done a good job with pool design and publicity, they pass without too much of a kerfuffle. I've seen ones come through at 70, 80% approval for aquatics, and if it being on the list from the ImagiNEXT initiative is any indication, I'm thinking that would be something that the community would likely support. I just don't know how far. That's where, like when Lynn County did their conservation bond, they did some polling ahead of time to figure out where's the sensitivity point. That's why they decided to go for 40 million rather than 60 or something else. They had determined that that was the one that was as far as they could push it, that had the most community support. And I would think we'd probably want to do something similar once we get through the phase of doing the aquatics study. But right now, that piece of it's not reflected in the CIP. It just has the potential to have a significant impact on the CIP, especially from the city council standpoint. Even though it's a voter-approved bond, the voters are going to say, yeah, this is going to cost 20 cents a year on the debt service, or 20 cents per thousand on the debt service levy on my property taxes. I'm willing to support that. I can tell you that when that happens, there's always pressure on you on the city council to figure out some way to scale it back somewhere else to still keep that property tax rate as low as you ultimately can.
Do we have a ballpark number at all for a new aquatics center?
We did an analysis within the master plan, and depending on if we look more towards a water park versus aquatic center, that's going to increase the overall cost. You could see somewhere up on the top end that we were estimating
Okay.
for it, or if you scale it back a little bit,
The water park concept?
Water park.
Aquatic center.
aquatic center would be the lower end at the
8 million.
We'll still have a lot
Right.
of water features, but
They're like
the park side of it would be a lot of your
is that like a Cedar Falls type? Is that like a Cedar Falls type facility?
Yeah, it would be more towards the Cedar Falls type, would be that water park, if you will, versus aquatic
Yeah.
center. What Cedar Rapids is built out is more of an aquatic center.
Right.
What they
I
have.
see the difference, yeah. We have people from Marion that drive up to Cedar Falls to go to their public pool or water park facility. Yeah.
The Lost Island?
No. The Cedar Falls
Oh, I
has their own.
Cedar Falls Municipal Pool.
I don't even know
Yeah.
what that
Seen it.
looks like.
Well, you should drive up there and take a look at it. Yeah, it's
So it's,
Let's look it out online.
again, depending, and I think once we get through that aquatic survey part of it, we'll be able to figure that out a little bit. And again, something that goes in the equation too, there's been a lot of talk out there about maybe private sector coming in to the area with a water park. That would drive our conversation of what we do in Marion if something like that would come in Cedar Rapids. You'd have to look at that as part of that overall process. I don't know that the area could absorb 2 water parks in proximity like that, so.
Is everybody Googling the Cedar Falls? That's what I kind of
Wait,
figured.
yeah, I'm like,
How did you know?
Everyone, I couldn't quite see the reflection in Renee's glasses, but
Will's trying to pull it up.
I just had a feeling.
Did whatever happened with Cedar Rapids building there? Wasn't that going to be like when the casino thing failed, and there was going to be some big? Don't go there. Okay.
Yeah.
no, it's not gonna. I don't think it's gonna happen.
Nick Ford, who's kind of been pushing that, has actually talked to us here in Marion about it. But I think it's kind of a chicken and egg thing. He's asking communities for support and wants to define what that support is so that he can go out and get investors to come in and do the project. At the same time, as a community, I like to see that you've got a certain amount of investors lined up before we actually take a look at the business plan to say, okay, this is the level of which we're ready to commit to it. And then you have to balance that. It's something that you just always have to take a look at when you're looking at a potential partnership like that. At what point are you such a big percentage of the overall financing that you just should bite the bullet and own it?
Right. Okay.
The next one I wanted to talk about there was the heart of it all. We've gone through, and I think the council knows that the first time we really talked about this plaza discussion was really related to the branding study as an area that could be done in the uptown. At the time the branding initiative was done, Roger Brooks had some really good data about the bump that these plazas will provide to the business sector around it. Normally, when you do a project like this and you program it throughout the year, adjoining businesses can see a 30% bump in revenues. Additionally, when we look at uptown residential units in particular, a household that's within walking distance of a business will spend $6,000 a year more at that business than someone who has to get in a car and drive. So, when we're talking about adding 150 housing units uptown between these two projects, that is a significant potential benefit. The other piece that is kind of unique to our plaza opportunity is the library. With the number of people that we have coming in and out of our library right now, the current design is what I would characterize as typical suburban design. It's a standalone facility. It was not walkable. It's car-based. Even more, though, I feel like our current library actively divorces the traffic coming in and out of that building from the uptown. Because if you drive in, you're parking on the south side of the building. You're coming in the south side of the building. You're coming back out. You're getting into your car and leaving. You don't have to necessarily even go past a business to get there. By having it be part of the mixed-use facility and be in the center of the uptown, whether people would be coming from the parking ramp or parking on the 7th Avenue side, they're going to be in proximity to businesses. So it's an opportunity to capitalize on that 1,000 to 1,100 people a day that are coming in and out of the facility and put them in front of the business community. One of the other challenges that we had, and this really became apparent the first time we applied for Main Street designation, is one of the major factors we didn't get it the first time we applied was because we don't have a retail loop. We have City Square Park, but people walk around it in kind of an L or a truncated U shape. There's no reason to walk completely around the park because the library was right there and cut off your retail opportunities. And so by looking at mixed use there and potentially having retail in the main floor of the parking ramp and on the bottom floor of the 6th Avenue side of the new mixed use facility, we complete that retail loop and give people more reason to circulate all around the uptown, which is more benefit then to everyone. Now the plaza is kind of a centerpiece of that. I mean, when they say it's at the heart of it all, that's a good name because it would be literally at the heart of the completed retail loop. Keys to it: having amenities that draw people down for other than just shopping. You know, when you see some of these, they'll have splash pads or they'll have ice rinks, but something that attracts people and brings people there year round. Another key is making sure they actually actively have it programmed. Their suggestion was to target at least 200 days a year worth of programming. Even if that program is only bringing 50 or 60 people down, by the time you figure out what you're attracting throughout the course of a year, you know, you're talking tens of thousands of people that otherwise wouldn't have come to the downtown. Even if it's passive exposure by knowing, well, there's a new business over there, I'm going to stop in. Getting them here is a key to that. We have a good start because I think we've got a good companion facility now with the Uptown Artway, with that stage, and the plaza can really complement that, but then I think really cement that amenity and that gathering place. City Square Park already is a pretty good spot for that, but if you think about the way that it's done right now, it's pretty episodic. You know, the concert series is great, but bringing 2,000 people in 4 Thursdays a month is really kind of underselling what we can do with that space. So it has not only a capital component, but potentially an operating component as well. Certainly as we're getting ready to start putting an events coordinator function together, this would be something that that position could really potentially grow into. We don't know yet what it would cost. I can hazard some guesses. Again, I think much like the swimming pool, you can probably spend about as much as you want on it within reason. At the low side, my gut tells me it's probably $1.5 million. At the top side, it's probably $4 million. Most of that's driven strictly by the footprint that we have to work in. The park board, I think, took a hard look at this, and they've endorsed going into the first V of the X of the sidewalks that we have going through the park. So if you take that plus what's currently the 11th Street parking area and where the planter box is, that's about the footprint of what you have to work with. It'd be kind of the gateway area into the front of the new library, so you'd have people coming in and coming past it, but then also businesses that would be around it in essentially all directions. We do have an opportunity here. When we did the contract for the preliminary design on the Uptown streetscape, we left an opening in there to be able to do a subcontract for plaza design, even as far as doing preliminary design on the extensions of the next phases of the Uptown Artway. So we tried to leave that door open depending on where this one ultimately lands. Of all the things that we have out there, this one has probably the most potential, immediate potential anyway, to go out and seek grant dollars and to seek donations for it. So my hope would be is that much like the amphitheater, while the city would have a piece of it, you know, we might be, I think on the amphitheater we ended up being about 1/3 of the overall capital cost for that, and the rest of it, I think we put $750 in, it was about $2.3 million, and the rest was financing and various grants that we were able to leverage.
This potential plaza project, would it obviously, it would interfere with the things that we're hosting up in the park now, correct? I mean, it would potentially force us to relocate Swamp Fox, Arts Festival, some of those things, correct?
Yep.
Thanks.
Why is that?
Construction period. I mean,
so
when
temporary.
When it can actually be built.
Temporary. It wouldn't,
Yeah.
not permanently, because eventually you could use the plaza as part of the programming space, right?
Yep.
But just temporarily. I just wanted to.
Yeah, it wouldn't require something permanent, but and that would be something we'd have to take a look at, depending on when your construction phasing occurs, and the big wild card for me in that one, Randy, is when does the parking ramp get done, when is the library done, and when can the library move? Because some of those events could potentially be moved over into the existing library block, even if you're just using the parking lot space while the City Square Park Plaza project would be being done. And if the council proceeds forward with the idea of closing down 11th Street in between the parking ramp and the existing library, that space could potentially be available to hold events before the plaza area is done.
We would envision the plaza area being done at the same time as the completion of the multi-use building with the library?
That would be the ideal schedule, just to
Yeah,
minimize
'cause
disruption
it's
of the
already
public.
all under
for-
construction.
Right.
Yeah.
All ripped up.
Much with the same reason why we're looking at the preliminary design for 7th Avenue now. If the multi-use project is going to require you to replace all the sidewalks and get out into the parallel parking areas, we need to know what elevations you have to build those to.
So Lon, you mentioned that the funding would be city and bonds, or city and grants and other things, but you didn't mention any fundraising. Could that be a component? One thing I don't think we've done, I haven't seen it, is pavers. I mentioned that, I think, in the park project with Mike, but I think particularly up here, that's a great mechanism to obviously get funds, but I think that this community in particular, there are a lot of people who have been here for a long time or come back. There's a lot of pride in the city, and I think I think I mentioned it before, Olympic Park, when they were doing that in Atlanta, and you could buy a brick. It was like $100, and it's a brick, and I don't know what the return on that is, but it's obviously high. I think that could be a neat opportunity to do something there and get some funds. I think a lot of people would be into that. I don't know.
Yeah, if the Uptown Artway is any indication, projects like this that create that sense of place that are unique are good attractors for doing fundraising. I can't remember off the top of my head what the fundraising was that we hit on the amphitheater project. I don't know if you remember, Mike, what the outside contributions were, but I would expect that we probably could get at least that amount for a project of this scale. I think we raised about $350,000 in outside contributions or so for the Artway. Do you remember, Amanda? 170? Okay, because I know Lynn County was 75 on their own, and then... And we did just receive our designation as another great place, and any of these projects that are on this list are eligible for grant assistance through the Great Places program. Then there's the Community Attractions and Tourism program, although we've kind of hit that one heavily in the last couple of years between Prospect Meadows and city projects, but there's nothing to preclude us from going back and seeing if we can tap that well again.
Hey, let's keep going back.
The amphitheater had some dollars from that in it, as did Prospect Meadows.
That's awesome. You followers or leaders?
Creekside Pride, of all the ones that we have out there, this is the one that I think, at least to me, has the least definition. The other ones, you're generally working within project boundaries, or you kind of know what the process is to be able to do something with that. This one would need some planning dollars up front, and I think that would be where the CIP would come into play, just to narrow down the range of options. You could do ponds in the area south of 29th Avenue and east of 10th Street, where we've got that wetland area. There's just a ton of potential up and down that creek to do it, but we need to kind of figure out which one's the most feasible, which one's the most cost effective, and just how far do you really want to go with it.
Did we define how long ImagiNEXT could take to build out, so to speak, during the process of soliciting? 10 years?
Yeah, 8 to 10 years.
Okay.
These are usually anticipated to be about 10 years. Assuming that you get the Corps of Engineers involved, which I think would be required on a project like this, probably more towards the top of that scale.
Yeah, 12 to 15.
Hopefully we're like.
Although this could be really a
We'll be
neat,
Paul's age.
But it could be very, very, very unique.
this could be a really neat project if we can even get some of it done, because it would be turning the creek into an actual amenity. We have this asset that goes through the middle of the city, and it's just sort of ignored. And if Stegerwald's not in here, he and I have canoed down it, and
Canoed?
yes.
On Indian Creek?
We had to get out and carry it a little bit.
Really?
But it is a
What,
beautiful.
during a flood?
It is a beautiful view of the city, and it's something you never think about, and it was a great eye opener for me, and I think it is an amenity that if we figured out how to use it, as other cities have with their features, water features through their city. I think it's worth at least looking at to see if we can turn it into an asset and an amenity rather than just having it be there. That's may flood every once in a while, and it's just sort of unnoticed and ignored.
Well, and the reason I say it's kind of undefined is it can be something as simple as just changing the way that you use the area around it and changing how you treat the stream banks and handling your erosion controls. I mean, those are relatively small that can increase the use and enjoyment of it, all the way to putting in cofferdams and having canoeing programs where you can come in and rent canoes and then use it throughout the facility. I mean, there's a ton. Just there are so many, it's going to need something to help narrow it down.
What's the widest, deepest place of Indian Creek? I mean, I've lived here a long, long time. And when I saw this come up as one of the top 4 ideas, it absolutely surprised me, because I'm
taking you canoeing.
I'd have to be very creative to figure out how to do all this with that little creek.
Mm-hmm. Man, when I was a kid, we used to tube that thing. I mean, we would go from Indian Creek, from Linwood Knolls all the way down to Thomas Park and tubes. Oh yeah, we lived in the creek when I was a kid.
I think Mike has a comment.
Yeah, well, to Steve's question, there are holes along Indian Creek that are 6 foot deep that are one location. As you cross that trail bridge down the Krumholtz property, just upstream from that, there's a fairly deep hole there. So they're scattered throughout, And then there's times of the year, if we're in more of a drought type situation, Indian Creek is a trickle.
Yeah.
But, a year like this year that's been rather wet, there's, really good flow through it consistently. So it's just a matter, if you think about what the potential can be, because there are some ways that you can hold some of that water back to increase the levels, those type of things, I would hope that there would be some stormwater management involved in that, because the one thing that I do not like about Indian and Dry Creek is their potential to flood and destroy the park system. So, there could be that overall recreational community benefit, and then also that stormwater management benefit. So it's definitely worth looking into, in my opinion. And, the lower end of the Krumholtz property right now, we're looking at restoration as far as oxbows and working through that scenario right now. So there's a lot of potential along Indian Creek. It just depends on how it all would come together and what sections you would target.
And when we keep talking about quality of life and workforce development, all those kinds of things, and young people today, their job is what they do between weekends, and it plays into all of that. Creating more opportunities for people to connect with nature, to enjoy nature in different ways. It's worth looking at if we can turn this existing creek into an asset and an amenity. So it may not work, but it's worth, I think, looking at.
I'm fine with that.
Yeah. It would be fun to take a GoPro camera down through there and get a video of it. Because you're right, from 2 feet above water level, everything has a different perspective.
It's a whole different view of the city.
Yeah.
Seriously.
And most people will never be able to experience it unless they physically wanted to get into that canoe or into that water and do it.
I'll talk to Todd. We'll line it up.
To get a video, a marketing piece for that, I think would be incredible. Or drone or something.
Geocaching trail along it or something to get people to explore.
Next time we get a really heavy rain.
Then have the fire department waiting down on the other end.
But not too heavy.
Yeah.
And realistically, we talk about ImagiNEXT and a 10-year plan, and I think Indian Creek, because, there is a substantial amount of Indian Creek that runs through Marion from the north side through the south. I really think overall development, that's a really long-range plan, and you're going to do segments over a course of, I would say, closer to probably 20 years on a plan like that to really make that really change the whole environment along Indian Creek, and then definitely you'd want to pull Dry Creek into that scenario just because of this, the springs that feed that portion and some opportunities there. But it's I think it's a neat project overall. I think you can see where I land on that one.
That's good. That's important.
We know how you voted in the ImagiNEXT.
Your opinion is important on that. Okay.
Okay, so that's the other ImagiNEXT initiatives. Like I said, that In the Know has more to do with pushing out communications, how we can connect with our citizens, and just a lot of the other little policy implications that people had wanted. I mean, anything that had to do with changing regulations about dogs in the parks, for example, kind of got lumped into that. So there may be some CIP implications, but I think there's a lot less potential coming out of that one than there are on the other side. Did you want to take a break since we're kind of back on schedule? Regroup a bit or forge ahead?
We're going to have one more item, right?
Yep.
Go.
All right. Funding sources. Okay. This one obviously has a big piece to do with the CIP, because ultimately what we can accomplish the CIP is going to come back to financing decisions that you make collectively as a city council for how far you're willing to go to do this. I can safely say that there probably is no limit to the amount that the city could spend on the CIP. The limitations are staff time capacity, for how much work departments can physically and literally handle throughout the course of a year, and also without me having to hire a mental health professional to do continual counseling for them. And then just how much disruption do you collectively as a council feel like the public can handle? I mean, we could put together a CIP that would attempt to repair every road in Marion in the same year, but your phones would never stop ringing because no one would ever be able to drive anywhere. So sometimes there's a natural cadence or a natural sequencing that has to happen. We can't do 7th Avenue until 6th Avenue is done. There are simple ones like that where you've got to have new capacity to be able to divert traffic while you do other projects. So some of them are simple, some of them not quite so much. On the funding side, there are several pieces that we've talked about with council in the past. Some of them are voted, some of them are not voted, or at your discretion. So when it comes to things like looking at programs in the proprietary funds, the amount that the council charges for sanitary sewer, for stormwater, for urban forest are all entirely at your discretion. We can put together a plan that can show, okay, if we want to accomplish this many $1 million of years, or millions of dollars per year in projects coming out of the sanitary sewer fund, this is what we need to charge for rates, and this would be a phase-in schedule to be able to get us there. We can do the same thing with stormwater. We can do the same thing with all of those proprietary funds. Road use is driven by the population of Marion. It is per capita. So the only opportunities that we get for that are the regular census and then the census in between, if we choose to do a special census on our own as we did the last time around. So that it's a little bit more limited. On property taxes, the council has unlimited authority on the debt service levy. The debt service levy, you can levy the amount that's necessary to service the debt in any given year, and it does not have limitations on it as far as the percentage that you or what the dollars per thousand is. The practical limit is general obligation bonding capacity. You do have a limit on what you can do for bonding capacity. Marion's bonding capacity right now is around $130 million. If we're carrying 55, then we're sitting at 42% of bonding capacity. That's just whatever appetite the city council has for using that type of debt. We have revenue debt that's available as well. Not something that we have used as extensively in the past, but something that we are looking at using for some of these coming projects in order to make sure that we're preserving that general obligation bonding capacity for more of our core projects. In the past, we have done debt backed by revenue, most notably TIF revenue, but we've done it as GO debt rather than doing it as strict TIF debt. GO debt is still the cheapest that we can get. It's got the most security, so you get your absolute best interest rates on doing general obligation debt. So some of the stuff like the Marion Enterprise Center, that was done as a general obligation bond, but rather than levying property taxes to pay for it, it's being paid for by tax increment financing revenues. There's nothing to prevent the council from doing GO and paying for it with something else. So sanitary sewer, stormwater, when you look at the budget, you'll see that those utilities are doing transfers into the debt service fund to pay their proportionate share of general obligation debt. But there's more opportunities there for us to do pure revenue bonds. There's a little bit of an interest rate premium that you pay for that. Much like they do with the city, if it's a bigger bond issue, they'll do an analysis of the credit worthiness of your utility, and then they'll set your rates according to that. But it's not unusual to see a 0.05 to 0.25% interest rate premium for doing straight revenue debt without backing it by GO. We also have the capital projects levy that can be done, and that is limited to about 67 cents per thousand. It's a voter approved levy, and that's one that can be done. Council can define specifically what you want to use it for. Like in the case when we've had discussions in the past, we've talked about using it for the annual asphalt overlay program. It would generate around $1 million per year that could go towards that annual program, and that's just what it would be used for. There are communities, Marshalltown has it, was passed by the voters. You can put it out there for 5 years, you can put it out there for 10 years, you could put it out there to not have it expire. That's exclusively under the control of the city council, just like when you actually would choose to put that out there.
Are we using any of that now?
No.
Capital project, none, or, okay.
No. The advantage of the capital projects levy is that money, while you can use it to do debt service, there's not really a reason to, as long as you're not completely tapped out in your bonding capacity, because you can borrow and then pay that back with the debt service levy. The capital projects levy is really geared towards more funding projects for cash year after year after year. But at $1 million a year, that's a pretty natural match for what we've been doing on the asphalt overlay program. It's a predictable amount. You know what it is. You can plan for it year after year, and it builds as the valuation across the community goes up, so it tends to rise over time. Like anything, though, I don't know that it keeps up with construction cost inflation, but it's better than not having anything out there. But it does have to be approved by the voters. Do you recall, Amanda, was it straight 50%, or it didn't have to hit the 60% hurdle, did it?
I don't believe so.
Okay. So unlike a bond vote where you're putting it out there and you've got the 60% supermajority, I believe that one is a 50% plus one to be able to get that passed. Finally, you have the franchise fee. And the budget that we just started does anticipate having a franchise fee put in place of 3% on electric and gas utilities. That would amount to about $3 million a year, but in this case, it's going towards the operating budget for the general fund with the intent of making sure that we've got everything that we need for a stable future funding source for the last round of hiring that we're going to need for the fire station, and that we have the dollars coming in to be able to fund the operating expenses for the facility once it's up and running. You've got a statutory limitation of 5% on franchise fees. So 3% does still leave a little bit of room. It's at the discretion of the council to be able to do that, but it is subject to reverse referendum. So you can put it out there, but if there's a petition filed, it does then require it to be put out to a vote. That happened in Burlington. The city council proposed putting forward a franchise fee. It was put out to a public vote, and it was defeated. I think in our case, we would look to, the first step is to do a revenue purpose statement. I think in our case, the revenue purpose statement would be to use those funds for public safety purposes. So they could be used for fire, they could be used for police. But again, as the community grows and as more homes connect to gas and electric, that fund tends to build. It's not completely neutral, because the first % of a franchise fee replaces the local option sales tax that's collected on gas and electric bills. So that amount, that first penny, would come out of the Lynn County pool and be replaced with a franchise fee. Marion tends to be a net beneficiary from the Lynn County pool, meaning that we get more dollars back than we put in. And so it's not quite a one-for-one. There would be a little bit of a loss there to the local option sales tax side of things. But again, since we're a beneficiary of that fund and collect more than we put in, if you take, I'll just use round numbers, if you take $200,000 off of the utility bills for local option sales tax, we would not lose $200,000 from the Lynn County fund. It would probably be more like $160,000 a year. So there's still a net gain to the community. Cedar Rapids does have a franchise fee on gas and electric already, so it's not a case where we would not be competitive with them in the metro area. They did that 7 or 8 years ago now. Started at 2% and then took it up to 3%.
When you increase the percentage, do you have to go back out to the voters?
That I'm not sure about. But you do have to actually, I mean, we have to open up the franchises with Mid-American, with Lynn REC, and with Alliant to be able to do this, because the enabling language has to be inserted into the franchises. They're generally not resistant to it. They'll put it in there, but they do want a trade-off. So if we've got 6 years left on a franchise with Alliant, you might have to add 10 years to that or something like that as a trade-off for getting that language in there. Now, there are some other things that the City Council can do that get a little bit more creative. I'm not sure how far you want me to go with some of these. Well, one option that you have, and this is something I think that actually that the public would like, is when you look at our sanitary sewer, you have the sanitary sewer fund, the operational account, but then you also have the sanitary sewer replacement fund. The replacement fund is the capital project side. It's carved out in that fund from the operational side of the equation. And they did that, I think, initially because of the Indian Creek trunk sewer project. That project was going to be so big and so expensive that there was a long-term plan put in place for a series of rate increases and a series of bonds to be able to pay for Marion's cost of doing that project. Now, the local option sales tax largely made that unnecessary for the first several phases of that, so we haven't had to actually follow through with it. But you could do the same thing with your other enterprise funds. You could do one with storm sewer, you could do one with urban forest, and actually separate that out. The nice thing about that is that if you do that, that's a predictable amount, and it's not going to get caught, okay, so you raised your sanitary sewer fees 5%, but 2 years from now your operating costs have gone up 4%, so you've really only got this much left that's now going towards capital projects. It's segregated, and it's something that can be followed through. You eliminate the risk of it getting caught or getting eroded over time by increases in operating costs for the utilities. So when we look at some of these, that's probably an option that we will be bringing back to the council. Specific to sanitary sewer, the council's going to have some decisions to make with that. We've presented to the council several times on the equity issue between single family and multifamily, between multi-tenant meters and single meters. I think in light of the fact that we already are phasing out the senior rate on garbage because of the problem that Cascade ran into with charging the same people different rates, it's time for us to look at doing that as well. That will bolster the revenues in that account some, but we'll have to come back to you with better estimates for exactly how much.
Okay with that.
Yeah.
You have a question, Will? Okay.
Yeah.
And then finally, I'm going to say this publicly for the first time. I've been toying around with the idea of a transportation utility, much like we did with urban forest, where we did a fee based on the cost of maintaining the urban forest canopy. I think you could do something similar with a utility that would be based around transportation, based on linear feet of curb in front of a property. And that would provide potentially a source of funding for that. Haven't run that past legal yet to see what their opinion on it is, but it's just an idea I've been throwing around out there about a potential new funding source.
What would we do with that money? What would our priorities kind of be in your mind of how we would spend that?
To me, it's an operating cost issue. It's for those annual programs. I mean, if you look at the CIP, the last council very highly ranked the annual programs, your maintenance, your asphalt overlay programs, a lot of those things that are needed just to keep the system that we have operational and running. I think that would be an excellent candidate for something like that. So it might be an alternative to doing the capital projects levy, for example.
Gotcha.
Oh, yes.
You're not talking about getting a bus line through Marion then?
No.
Not yet.
So where's the fee coming from for that? Who are we charging?
It would be against any utility accounts. Just like we do with urban forest, there's a monthly charge on the utility bills for the urban forest utility.
So it'd be to the homeowners, it'd be a new fee.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I see.
Yep.
Be to everybody though.
Yeah.
Commercial also.
Yep. Yeah, any account. And if the idea is, and the reason I've been looking at it is because the principle of the stormwater utility has been held up in court, which is that you charge by categories according to your impervious surface. So like in the case of a home, we come up with the typical impervious surface for a residential property in Marion. That's your equivalent runoff unit or your equivalent residential unit. And then your commercial properties that might have 5 times that pay 5 times that fee because that's their equivalent for the runoff that they're generating. I think you could do the same thing and make a similar case for transportation based on linear feet of curb that would be in front of a property. I don't know that I'm anxious to be the test case on it, but it was something that I did want to toss out there that I've been toying around with in the back of my mind.
Does anyone else have a fee like that around us? Any of our comps that we always compare ourselves to?
No, but in fairness, we also don't have casino revenue like Dubuque or Bettendorf or some of those places either. So some of them have additional revenue sources that we can't fall back on. There are other places like Urbandale, that have made other choices where, they don't, they're part of the Des Moines water and wastewater system, so they don't have operating costs for those types of systems. They just pay somebody else to do that. So there's a lot of variation in those areas. Like I said, it's not fully developed. I haven't run it past legal. It's just something I've been toying around with.
Interesting.
Okay. Any I missed?
Is that it?
No. But the reason I wanted to bring those up is because as you make decisions on the CIP, the size of the CIP and how much you're willing to allocate in an annual year is really going to determine how much we need to tap into those funding sources. As it is right now, we've got the CIP constructed about basically anticipating that it's kind of all hands on deck for all of those other than the last one.
So, having gone through all this, what's our homework for the 30th? What should we be thinking about? And
You'll be getting a packet that has the existing CIP along with the updated project sheets, so you can see the updated numbers that the departments have submitted, any changes in projects that have been put together between now and then, and start thinking about, how would you like to start ranking those? Where would your true priorities be? We wanted to go through all of this to help equip you to be able to make those, because some of you might feel, well, this plan is more important to me, so those are the projects that I'm going to support versus this one. Last time I kind of felt like we left the past council out there without a net and just threw $200 million worth of projects at you without preparing you with all this context ahead of time.
The biggest question I'm going to have is, what is our real capacity on what we can do in a year? I'm always a believer that I'd rather put a list of projects out there for a particular year, go after it, get it done. Everybody knows those are the top priority for that year, and we get it done versus, we throw $40 million into the pool, we get 30 million of it done. Everybody's stressed because there's a bunch we did not get done. They're a work in process. They carry over. So I'm really interested in, if we look at our past years, what do we try to do? What could we get done? And really being really honest with ourselves. And what is our capacity? I don't want to put any more stress on it, but I also want to make sure our top priority projects get done instead of everything getting done 80% instead of 100% getting 100% done.
Yeah, and on some of them, it's a little easier than others.
I understand, weather and all that, but
well, weather. But I'll pick on Mike for example a little bit. The 7th and 7th project, he's shown you the reams of federal paperwork associated with that. That might have been a $3 or $4 million project, but because it was a federal project, it was much, much, much more time intensive than $4 million of a local option sales tax funded project.
Yeah.
Same thing, construction administration on a single project that's $9 million might be the same as a project that's $1 million. So some of them it's easy to draw a relationship between dollar amount spent and workload, but we can give you some better ideas, I think, with just what work plans the departments have and how much capacity they feel like they can handle with staff.
That's fine.
Amanda already touched on that just with the Wi-Fi project and the impact that could potentially have on the camera project if we were to take that on as a full bore project right now.
Okay.
I have a question about what we're going to get next week with the list of everything. Is it going to be the same format as last time so we know what we're looking at?
Yep, there will be one-page summaries, one page for each project.
Okay, so we're not going to have to get retrained on how to read it?
No.
Okay.
Okay. Kim?
Yeah, I just had a question about, hey, any more thought to like Art in the Alley? Are we going to go further with that, or where would that fit in?
I think, to me, when we're doing the streetscape design for the Uptown, if the council's going to allocate resources to add to that contract to do preliminary design for the plaza, then we also should have the ImagiNEXT tied to that as well, because it's a logical extension. Everything that Mike is going to be working on for designing the sidewalks, figuring out the utilities, if we're going to need to run power up what used to be an alley to get to a sculpture, then we should know that and we should plan for that as part of the overall infrastructure project. Even if we don't carry it out right now, having that plan and knowing the extent of how far out we're going to go would be critical.
Anything else? Ahead of schedule. Very good. This was very productive, very, very useful. I think, at least for me it was, and I'm sure it was for everyone else. I think it's great to have the full big picture again to inform the specific decisions we're going to be making as time goes on. So, all right. Thank you, everyone, for your patience and participation.
Thank you, everybody.
Have a good weekend.
Have a good weekend.